Chapter 6. Another Chance at a Home. Joe's schoolhouse exile ended in November of 1924 when Thula gave birth to her first daughter, Rose. She demanded that the family leave Boulder City for good, so they picked up Joe at the schoolhouse, drove to Seattle, and moved into the basement of Thula's parents' home. With another infant to tend to, Thula was no happier in their cramped quarters here, though. Once again, Joe always seemed to be in her way. So when Harry got a new job with a logging company, a half-day's journey west of Seattle, Thula said Joe had to leave too. Harry took his son, still 10, to live with a family near the camp. By 1925, Harry had saved enough money to buy an auto repair and tire shop in Sequim, a small town northwest of Seattle. Sequim sat on a wide expanse of prairie between the snow-capped Olympic Mountains and the broad blue waters of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. The weather was dry compared to rain-drenched Seattle, so dry that early settlers had found cacti growing on the open prairies. Harry's shop was right downtown, and the whole family moved into a small apartment above it. Joe enrolled in the Sequim school and spent his weekends tinkering with the cars in his dad's garage. When the mayor of Sequim accidentally smashed up Harry's car one day, he replaced it with a newer model, and Harry gave Joe his old Franklin so he could learn by repairing it. Another little girl arrived, Joe's half-sister Polly, and Harry bought some farmland outside town and began building a new house by hand. The farmland was rough and raw, covered by hundreds of stumps from the forest that had recently been logged off. Joe and his dad began to dig up the stumps. They dug a ditch to divert water from the nearby Dungeness River to a water wheel that Harry built. The water wheel powered a sawmill that Harry also built. Then he felled some of the few trees still standing on the property and used the lumber to frame a 2-story house. He and Joe collected smooth river rocks from the Dungeness and erected an enormous stone fireplace. The house was still only half completed when Harry sold the shop and moved everyone out to the farm. Over the next 2 years, the work continued. Joe and his dad built a wide front porch, a wood shed, and a ramshackle hen house that soon became home to more than 400 chickens. They constructed a rickety milking barn for half a dozen dairy cows. Joe's dad even figured out a way to use the water wheel and the sawmill to generate electricity for lights in the house. On dark winter nights, the lights flickered on and off, depending on how much water was flowing through the water wheel. They never quite finished the house, but that made little difference to Joe. Once again, he felt like he had a home, and he had a new world to explore. The meadow behind the house was covered with sweet wild strawberries in summer. The water flowing from the water wheel formed a deep, wide pond, which became home to salmon and steelhead and trout that swam down the ditch from the Dungeness. Whenever Joe wanted fish for dinner, he simply took out a net, picked one out, and hauled it in. At night, as he lay in bed, he could hear bears splashing in the pond for fresh salmon and trout of their own. Sometimes he could hear cougars shrieking out in the dark woods. At school, Joe became a popular and successful student. He was a particular favorite of Miss Flatibo, the music teacher. As the years passed, he acquired a collection of old, used stringed instruments, including a mandolin, several guitars, a ukulele, and 2 banjos. He'd play on the front porch after school, patiently mastering each instrument one by one. Soon he took to carrying one of the guitars onto the school bus. He'd sit in the back and play and sing as the other kids gathered around. There was one student in particular, a pretty girl named Joyce Simdars, who seemed to enjoy the music more than the rest. She had blonde curls, a button nose, and a fetching smile. Joyce was a bright, intellectually curious girl brought up in a severely strict household. Her father was cold and distant, more likely to cuddle the family dog than one of his own children. He believed that hard work meant more than anything, and that no amount of it was too much. Yet it was her mother's unusual religious views that had had the most powerful effect on Joyce. Her mother believed that there was only a good Joyce. To her mother, the Joyce who misbehaved on occasion was actually an imposter. So when Joyce did something wrong, she ceased to exist for her mother. This bad Joyce was made to sit on a chair in a corner and then was ignored completely until mysteriously the good Joyce finally reappeared. Confused, young Joyce would sit there in the corner, sobbing and checking on herself over and over again, thinking, "But I'm still here. When Joyce first laid eyes on Joe Rance, strumming his guitar in the back of the school bus, singing some funny old song, and flashing his big, white, toothy grin, she was drawn to him immediately. and the first time Joe glanced up the school bus aisle and noticed this pretty girl coming toward him, his heart lit up. Soon she was sitting by his side every day, singing along with him in perfect harmony. Before long, though, life in the Rance family began to sour once more. One winter morning, Thula accidentally tripped and dropped an iron skillet full of hot bacon grease, potatoes, and onions. Harry Jr. was lying on the floor, and the skillet landed square on his chest. He and Thula screamed simultaneously. He ran out the door and threw himself in a snowbank, but the damage was done. His chest was hideously burned and blistered. Confined to bed, he soon came down with pneumonia, and by the time he was well, he had missed a year of school. In the fall of 1929, Joyce Simdar's family home burned to the ground while the family was away. Joyce was sent off to live for a time with family in Montana. The loss was a great one for Joe. All at once, his morning bus ride to school was not what it had been. But much worse trouble lay ahead. A month after Joyce left, disaster struck Wall Street, the financial capital of the business world. The stock market crashed, triggering the Great Depression. Companies were destroyed across the country. Businesses and family farms collapsed. In Sequim alone, the dozens of families simply walked away from their homes and farms, many leaving their dogs behind to fend for themselves. Just a week after the stock market crash, packs of these dogs began appearing daily on the Rance family farm, chasing the cows, nipping at their legs. Soon the cows were too tired to give milk. 2 weeks later, minks stole into the henhouse and slaughtered dozens of chickens, leaving their bloody corpses piled up in the corners. Joe's family had survived mostly by selling milk and eggs. Now they had little of either. Then one rainy afternoon in November, the school bus dropped off Joe just as darkness was enveloping the house. Walking up the driveway, stepping over potholes full of rainwater, Joe noticed his father's car, its engine running. Something was tied to the roof with a tarp over it. The younger kids were sitting in the back seat among suitcases and peering at him through steamy windows. Thula was sitting in the front seat, staring straight ahead. Joe's dad stood on the porch, watching him approach. Joe mounted the porch steps. His father's face was drawn and white. "What's up, Pop? Where are we going?" Joe murmured. Harry looked down at the boards planking the porch, then raised his eyes and gazed off into the dark, wet woods, looking over Joe's shoulder. "We can't make it here, Joe. There's nothing else for it. Thula won't stay. At any rate, she's insisting." "Where are we going to go?" Harry turned to meet Joe's eyes. "I'm not sure. Seattle for now, then California maybe. But, son, the thing is, Thula wants you to stay here. I would stay with you, but I can't. The little kids are going to need a father more than you are. You're pretty much all grown up now anyway." Joe froze. His gray blue eyes locked onto his father's face, suddenly blank and expressionless, like stone. Stunned, trying to take in what he had just heard, unable to speak, Joe reached out a hand and laid it on the rough-hewn cedar railing, steadying himself. Rainwater dripping from the roof splattered in the mud below. Joe's stomach lurched. Finally, he sputtered, "But can't I just come along?" "No, that won't work. Look, son, if there's one thing I've figured out about life, it's that if you want to be happy, you have to learn how to be happy on your own." With that, Harry strode back to the car, climbed in, closed the door, and started down the driveway. In the back seat, Mike and Harry Jr. peered through the oval rearview window. Joe could see Harry Jr. mouthing the words, "But what about Joe? What about Joe?" Joe watched the red taillights fade and disappear into a dark shroud of rain. He was 15 years old, and he was on his own. Chapter 7. A Rare and Sacred Thing. As the first weeks of cruise season wore on, and the boys continued to toil aboard Old Nero, the weather turned raw and cold. Rain pelted their bare heads and shoulders. Their oars slapped against the wind-tossed waves, spraying icy water back into their faces, stinging their eyes. Their hands grew so numb that they could never be sure they had a proper hold on their oars. They could not feel their ears or noses. The cold lake beneath them seemed to suck warmth and energy out of them. Their aching muscles cramped up the moment they stopped moving. And the colder the weather got, the more boys gave up on crew. Even with most of the rich kids gone, Joe still stuck out among the survivors. He showed up every day in the same rumpled sweater, and almost every day the boys continued to make fun of it. He began going to practice early to change into his rowing clothes before the others arrived. Joe and Roger slowly became friends. Most days, Joe sat with him in the cafeteria. Occasionally, they talked about their engineering classes. As often as not, though, they ate in silence. Roger didn't always say much, but there was a strand of affection and respect between them that Joe didn't feel with most of the boys in the shell house. It didn't really require a lot of talking. For Joe and Roger, practice was only one part of a long, hard day. Roger walked 2.5 miles to school each day from his parents' house, then slogged home again after classes and practiced to help with family chores. On weekends, he played saxophone in a band at night for extra money. During the day, he worked for his family's moving business, hoisting heavy sofas and beds and pianos in and out of homes all over town. This was often sad work, as he moved families out of houses they'd worked a lifetime to acquire and lost because of the Depression. Too often, men stood hollow-eyed and women wept in doorways as Roger loaded the last of their possessions onto a truck. But with businesses failing all over the country and so many fathers and sons left without jobs, Roger was thankful his family had work at all. After engineering classes each day, Joe hurried to crew practice, then on to his job in the student athletic store. He worked there until midnight, then trudged through the rain and the dark to the YMCA. In exchange for working as a janitor there, he was given a tiny dark room in the basement. The room was part of what had been a coal bin, and it was just big enough for a desk and a bed. For Joe, the room represented little more than a place to do his homework and stretch out his aching frame for a few hours before heading off to classes again in the morning. It was not anything one could call a home. By the end of October, the original mass of hopeful rowers had been whittled down to 80 boys competing for a seat in the first 2 freshman boats. There would be a third boat and a fourth boat, too, but the young men knew that practically nobody sitting in them would have a shot at making the top team, the varsity, the following year. On October 30th, Coach Bowles decided it was time to move the best of them out of Old Narrow and into shell barges. Both Joe Rance and Roger Morris were picked to move up. Joe was bursting with pride the first time he sat down in one of the new boats. The shell barges were easy to capsize and difficult to maneuver. Joe and Roger would have to learn an entirely new set of skills simply to remain upright. But these boats still weren't the sleek, narrow racing shells they'd rowed if they made the final team. Those boats happened to be some of the finest, fastest, most beautiful shells in the world, and they were built by hand right there in the Washington Shell House. The man who shaped them, George Yeoman Pocock, was the same mysterious figure who'd been watching the boys so closely since their first meeting. And the reason he'd been studying them was that he knew as much about the fine art of rowing as he did about the art of building shells. Pocock was all but born with an oar in his hands. Raised in England, within sight of some of the finest rowing water in the world, he was descended from a long line of boat builders. His father crafted shells for Eton College, just across the Thames River from Windsor Castle. Gentlemen's sons had been rowing competitively at Eton since the 1790s. At the age of 15, George began working alongside his father, laboring with hand tools to maintain and add to Eton's fleet. But he didn't just build boats. He also learned to row them, and to row them very well. At Eton, the coaches taught the boys to use long strokes, but George came to prefer the quick, powerful rowing style of the men who worked carrying passengers and freight on the Thames River. He adapted their style, inventing a more efficient stroke. Soon, George and his brother Dick were out racing the aristocratic Eton boys, then giving informal rowing lessons to them after their classes. When George was 17, his father entered him in a professional race and told him he could build his own boat for the contest from scrap lumber. He gave his son some advice that George never forgot. No one will ask you how long it took to build. They will only ask who built it. So George took his time, carefully and meticulously, handcrafting a single shell from Norwegian pine and mahogany. He won the race, defeating a field of 58 oarsmen and bringing home a large cash prize. Late in 1910, his father lost his job at Eton. It was a crushing blow. The two brothers did not want to be a burden to their father, so they boarded a boat to Canada, where they heard it was possible to make a good living working in the woods. They traveled west to Vancouver and toiled at a series of dangerous jobs, one of which cost George 2 of his fingers. In 1912, the Vancouver Rowing Club heard of their reputation in England and paid them to build 2 single sculls, or boats, for individual oarsmen. The brothers set up shop in an old derelict shed floating out in the harbor. There, 50 yards offshore, they finally resumed what would be their life's work. The shop was not ideal. Daylight showed through the roof, rain shuddered through the wide gaps between the wallboards. To bathe every morning, they dove out the window of their unheated bedroom and into the cold salt water of the harbor. At low tide, the water receded and the shed sat on a mud bank. When the tide surged back in, the structure would remain stuck to the mud and gradually fill with water. Finally, the mud would loosen its grip and the shop would burst back to the surface, water rushing out the doors at each end. Even in these conditions, the brothers built beautiful boats, and word of their craftsmanship soon spread in Canada and America. One blustery, gray day, George looked out the window of the floating workshop and saw a gangly and awkward man with a shock of reddish but graying hair flying in the wind. He was flailing his oars, not making progress in any direction. He looked, George thought, like a bewildered crab. Dick thought he must be drunk. Eventually, the brothers snagged the man's boat and dragged it alongside the workshop. When they helped him aboard, he grinned, stuck out a large hand, and boomed out, "My name is Hiram Conybeare. I am the rowing coach at the University of Washington." Conybeare had become Washington's coach because nobody else was available to take the job, not because he knew the first thing about rowing. But he'd heard about the brothers, and he wanted a few of their long, sleek, elegant shells for the team. So he had made the journey to Vancouver. Soon the Pocock brothers moved down to Seattle and set up a new workshop at the University of Washington. George began to watch the Washington oarsmen on the water and quickly spotted problems in their technique. At first, he held his peace. But when Conybeare began to ask the Pococks for their opinion about his boys' rowing, George gradually spoke up. He began to teach the coach the more efficient style he developed in England, and the changes soon resulted in Washington's first significant victories. Before long, the other schools were taking note of the style, trying to figure out something so different could be so successful. Conybeare died just a few years later in 1917 when he climbed too far out on a limb while reaching for a plum in a tree in his backyard and plunged head first to the ground. By then, however, Washington had become a serious contender in the college rowing world, and the coaches that followed Conybeare came to rely on George for more than his boats. His brother, Dick, moved east to build shells for Yale, but George remained at Washington. Over the years, he watched many powerful and proud boys try to master the sport. As he studied and worked with them and counseled them, he learned much about the hearts and souls of young men. He learned to see hope where a boy thought there was no hope. He saw the power of trust, the strength of the affection that sometimes grew between a pair of young men, or among a boatload of them, striving honestly to do their best. And he came to understand how those almost mystical bonds of trust might lift a crew to another place, where 9 boys somehow became one thing, a thing that was so in tune with the water and the earth and the sky above that, as they rowed, effort was replaced by ecstasy. It was a rare thing, a sacred thing, and George Euman Pocock, the man who'd been watching Joe and the other hopeful freshmen, knew more about it than anyone. Chapter 8. Going It Alone. Rain was still pounding the roof of the half-finished house in Sequim when 15-year-old Joe woke up alone the morning after his family left him. A wind had come up during the night, and it moaned in the tops of the fir trees behind the house. Joe lay in bed for a long time, listening, remembering the days he spent lying in bed in his aunt's attic in Pennsylvania, listening to the moaning of trains in the distance. The same fear and loneliness he felt then was weighing on him again, pressing down on his chest. He did not want to get up, did not really care if he ever got up. Finally, though, he crawled out of bed, made a fire in the wood stove, put water on to boil, fried some bacon, and made some coffee. Very slowly, as he ate the bacon and the coffee cleared his mind, the spinning in his head began to lessen. He found himself creeping up on a new realization. It surprised him, but he opened his eyes and seized it, took it in, understood it all at once. He was sick and tired of finding himself scared and hurt and abandoned, and endlessly asking himself why. Whatever else came his way, he wasn't going to let anything like this happen again. From now on, he would make his own way. He would find his own route to happiness. As his father had said, he'd prove to his father and to himself that he could do it. He wasn't going to be a hermit and live completely alone. Friends, he knew, could help him push away the loneliness, but he would never again let himself depend on them, nor on his family, nor on anyone. He would survive, and he would do it on his own. He made some oatmeal and sat back down to think some more. His father had always taught him that there was a solution to every problem, but he had always said that sometimes the solution wasn't where people would ordinarily expect it to be. You might have to look in unexpected places and think in new and creative ways. He could survive on his own, he figured, if he just kept his eyes open for opportunities. Over the next few weeks and months, Joe began to fend entirely for himself. He drove iron stakes into the ground to defend the chicken coop against future mink attacks, and treasured the few eggs he gathered every morning. He foraged in the dripping woods for mushrooms, gathered the last of the autumn's blackberries, netted the last of the fish from the pond. He picked watercress for salads. Watercress and berries would only go so far, though. He knew he was going to need some money in his pocket, so he drove downtown in the old Franklin car his father had left behind, parked and sat on the hood, playing his banjo in the rain, hoping for spare change. In 1929, though, there was no such thing as spare change. Jobs and money were hard to find in towns like Sequim. People held on to every penny they had. His only audience consisted of a few stray dogs who sat on their haunches, watching him idly and scratching their fleas. The only human who paid him any attention was a bearded character everyone called the Mad Russian, a man who had been wandering Sequim streets barefoot and muttering to himself for as long as anyone could remember. Joe dug deeper into his imagination for another way to earn money. Months before, he and his friend Harry Secor had discovered a spot on the Dungeness River where huge Chinook salmon lay in deep, green, swirling pool. Some were as much as 4 feet long. Joe found a gaff hook in the barn, hid it in his pocket, and ventured up to the spot one misty Saturday morning with Harry. They worked their way through a tangle of cottonwood trees lining the Dungeness, dodging the game warden who patrolled the river. The boys cut a stout pole from a tree branch, lashed the gaff hook to it, and then stealthily approached the swift, cold river. If they were caught, there would be big trouble. The rules of fishing were strict. You were only allowed to catch the salmon with a proper hook and a line. The pole and hook the boys had devised was illegal, but Joe was desperate. He took off his shoes, rolled up his pants, and waded quietly into the shallows upstream from the pool. When Joe was in position, Harry started throwing large river rocks into the pool and beating the surface with a stick. In a panic, the fish dashed upstream toward Joe. As they flashed by, Joe aimed the gaff at one of the largest of them, thrust the pole into the water, and deftly snagged the fish under the gills. Then he stumbled out of the water and dragged the thrashing salmon up onto the gravel bank. Joe feasted on salmon that night, alone in the house. Then he set about turning the snagging of salmon into a business. Each Saturday afternoon, he hiked the 3 miles into town with one or more of the enormous salmon slung over his shoulder, their tails dragging in the dust behind him. He sold the fish for cash or traded them for butter or meat or gas for his car. Later that winter, Joe discovered another way of making some cash, and again, it wasn't exactly legal. Under the Prohibition laws, selling alcoholic drinks was illegal in 1929, but men called bootleggers made a living by sneaking liquor into the country and selling it to their customers. Joe discovered that a bootlegger named Byron Nobel was making the rounds in Sequim every Friday night, quietly leaving bottles behind particular fence posts. Joe learned to follow Nobel's big black car around town on dark, frosty nights and swipe the bottles before Nobel's customers could get to them. In their place, Joe left bottles of dandelion wine he and Harry Secor brewed up in Joe's barn. Then Joe quietly sold the liquor to his own list of satisfied customers. When he wasn't catching salmon or stealing booze, Joe threw himself into any kind of legitimate work he could find. He dug tunnels under tree stumps in his neighbors' pastures and pried them out of the earth with long iron bars, or packed dynamite under them and blew them sky high. He stooped and scraped with a shovel, digging irrigation ditches by hand. With a long-handled, double-edged axe, he split fence rails from massive cedar logs. He dug wells and built barns, crawling around in the rafters, pounding nails. He lugged 120-pound pound cans of milk and sweet cream around dairy farms. As summer came on, he labored under pale blue skies in the dry fields, cutting hay, forking it into wagons, and hoisting it by the ton into the lofts of his neighbors' barns. Later, he found work helping his older neighbor, a logger named Charlie McDonald. Together, Joe and Charlie worked a 7-foot two-man saw back and forth across the trunks of immense cottonwood trees. Sometimes it took an hour or more for them to fell a single tree. Then they lopped off all the branches with axes and pried the bark from the logs with long iron bars. Finally, they harnessed them to Charlie's draft horses so they could be dragged out of the woods and sent to a pulp mill. Later, Joe found a more enjoyable way to make a few dollars when he and 2 of his school friends formed a band. With Joe on the banjo, they played during intermissions at the movie theater and at dances in nearby towns. They seldom made much money, but their performances got them into the theaters and dance halls for free. Often now he would take his dinner with the McDonald family, which was better than eating in solitude, sitting at one end of the large table where his family used to gather for boisterous dinners. But at the end of the day, he was always alone, back in the big, empty, half-finished house. Sometimes he plinked at the keys of his mother's old piano and floated simple melodies through the dark, empty spaces of the house as the lights powered by the water wheel flickered on and off. Other times he sat on the front steps and played his banjo and sang quietly to himself late into the night. There was one bright spot in Joe's lonely life. Joyce Simdars had returned from Montana. Joe often invited her to the Chicken Coop, Sequim's most popular dance hall, but she was rarely allowed to go, and only when her mother could accompany her. In many ways, Joy's heavily supervised life could not have been more different from Joe's completely independent one. While her father worked outside tirelessly, her mother assigned her endless chores inside. She was always washing dishes, scrubbing floors, and wiping windows, even though she detested housework. She would much rather be outside, working in the vegetable garden or tending to the animals with her father. She liked how farm work often involved solving practical problems or making something new. She loved to take things apart and see how they worked. That appealed to her intellectual curiosity. She was already a great student, interested in everything from photography to Latin to logic. Although she understood that Joe's life had been hard and lonely, to Joyce he seemed the very embodiment of freedom. She saw in him a window to a wider, sunnier world. He made his own rules, played his silly songs, and wandered in the woods at will, finding food or things he could use. But best of all, he seemed to care for her, just as she was. To Joe, there was no good Joyce or bad Joyce, just Joyce. And that was enough. Many girls, she knew, would turn away from a boy as poor as Joe, but not her. She decided that someday she would make up for the way the world had so far treated Joe Rance. In the summer of 1931, Joe received a letter from his older brother, Fred, now a chemistry teacher at Roosevelt High School in Seattle. Fred wanted Joe to come live with him and his family and complete his senior year of high school at Roosevelt. If he did well at Roosevelt, Fred said, Joe just might be able to get into the University of Washington. Joe was wary. After nearly 2 years of struggle, he was finally beginning to get his feet under himself, to make it on his own. He did not want to leave Joyce either, but the prospect of studying at a great high school and possibly moving on to the university was just too exciting to pass up. He boarded up the farmhouse, promised Joyce he'd be back at the end of the school year, and moved in with Fred. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he found himself with 3 square meals a day and little to do except attend school and explore his interests. He excelled in the classroom and quickly worked his way onto the dean's honor roll. He sang and performed in plays and made music. He signed up for the men's gymnastics team and proved to be a standout on the rings, the high bar, and the parallel bars. One spring day in 1932, as he was practicing on the high bar in the gym, he noticed a tall man in a dark gray suit and a fedora standing in the doorway and watching him intently. The man disappeared, but a few minutes later, Fred walked into the gym and called Joe over to the door. "A fellow just came to my classroom and asked who you were," Fred said. "Said he was from the university. He gave me this. Said you should look him up when you get to the U, that he might be able to use a fellow like you." Fred handed Joe a card, and Joe glanced down at it. Alvin M. Ulbrichson, head coach, crew, University of Washington Athletic Department. Joe pondered the card for a moment, then walked to his locker and put it in his wallet. It couldn't hurt to give it a try. Rowing couldn't be any harder than cutting cottonwoods.